In the last lecture, we discussed the preconditions which made the Industrial Revolution possible, and then examined its course through the experience of one industry, cotton manufacture. In this lecture, we will examine the repercussions of those developments for nations, for economies, for social groups, and for people. First, for nations. Before 1815, industrialization was very much a British phenomenon. What Japan and Korea were to the electronics industries in the 1980s and 90s, Britain was to the whole world for manufactured goods. The resulting wealth built the great British cities of the North and the Midlands, Manchester, Birmingham, Sheffield, and Bradford. Manchester grew from 75,000 people in 1801 to 303,000 by 1851. Birmingham from 71,000 to 233,000. Bradford from 13,000 to 104,000 people by 1851. The Industrial Revolution linked these cities to each other and to the rest of Britain with railways. This made possible the easier shipment of raw materials and goods and people. It also facilitated better communication. In 1840, the British introduced the penny post. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, the Royal Mail claimed to be able to deliver any letter to anywhere in the British Isles in just one day. Industrialization linked Britain to the rest of the world with steamships. In the 1830s, the engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel built the Great Western Railway from London to Bristol. He also built Paddington Station and Bristol Temple Meads and innumerable tunnels and bridges. In 1838, his steamship, the Great Western, initiated regular service between Bristol and New York. So the idea was a complete service from London Paddington to the docks of Manhattan. Also in 1838, Samuel Cunard and a group of investors from Glasgow and Liverpool formed the Cunard Line. In 1840, his first transatlantic liner, the Britannia, deported from Liverpool to Boston. Now, the sheer statistical data on the British Industrial Revolution is staggering. Between 1782 and 1852, industrial production grew 3 to 4% a year. That may not sound like much today, but it was unprecedented in European history. By 1830, Britain produced 70% of the world's coal, 50% of the world's cotton, cloth, and iron. By the 1870s, Britain produced 50% of the world's steel and owned 1/3 of the world's shipping and 1/2 of the world's railways. Though the British population only doubled 1800 to 1850, per capita income rose 85%. Britain became the world supplier of cottons, woolens, cutlery, pots, pans, stoves, grates, railway engines, and steamships. The rest of Europe would only begin to compete in the 1830s and 40s. First Belgium, then France, northern Italy, western Prussia, then Bohemia, and after 1900, Russia. Britain's leadership role was put on display at the world's first World's Fair, the Crystal Palace Exhibition of 1851. Dreamed up by Queen Victoria's consort, Prince Albert, the idea was to provide a showcase for the goods and scientific achievements of the world. But of course, it was easily dominated by British manufacturers and the products of the British Empire. At the time of the Crystal Palace Exhibition, per capita income was 32.6 pounds per annum in Britain, 21.1 pounds in France, and only 13.3 pounds per annum in Central Europe. Perhaps the greatest marvel of all was the vast iron and glass building that housed it all, the Crystal Palace, designed by Sir Joseph Paxton and built in prefabricated units. And yet, the Crystal Palace stood just a few miles away from some of the worst slums in Europe. It is now time to ask about the human side of the Industrial Revolution. Now, as you might expect, the human implications of industrialization, like anything else in European history, varied considerably depending on what class or group to which you belonged. First, the aristocracy. In the short term, the Industrial Revolution would seem to have had little impact on the landed aristocracy. They're not going to work in factories. But the wealthiest and the smartest, of course, exploited their mineral and forest rights and invested in the factories and in railway and steamship lines, and so they grew even wealthier. But in the long run, the Western European aristocracy would begin to be infiltrated and challenged by a new, more powerful middle class. Now, in fact, in the course of the 19th century, and as a result of the Industrial Revolution, the old middling orders split. The upper middling orders, the great merchants and professionals with money to invest, were able to profit from a growing economy. They became factory owners or shareholders. They became wealthy, sometimes fabulously so. We've all heard of the Wedgwood China dynasty, or the Vickers arms manufacturing, or Cadbury's chocolate in Britain. In France, the Rothschild banking family. In Germany, the Krupps. And in the United States, the Astors and the Vanderbilts and the Morgans. Many entrepreneurs were able to make enough from the family firm to buy their way into the aristocracy, purchasing great landed estates, building great houses, sending their sons to exclusive schools. In Britain, you might purchase a seat in Parliament, or perhaps even be named to a peerage. Later, American heiresses would do a brisk marital trade with needy European aristocrats. Throughout Europe, but especially in the West, this new wealthy middle class would increasingly demand political power. What about those towards the bottom of the old middling orders, those who were unable to invest in the new factory system, the shopkeepers, the craftsmen, the artisans? Well, they were unable to compete with the Industrial Revolution. Imagine coming from a family of cobblers who'd made shoes by hand, perhaps for generations. Your shoes might be of superior quality to those turned out by a factory, but given your costs for raw materials and overhead, the time it took to sew one shoe, you simply could not compete with the cheap, mass-produced shoes created in factories. These people, cobblers, tailors, ironworkers, fell out of the middle class. Apprenticeship died out because there were no longer any skills to learn. Factory work took no skill. Seeking factory work at sometimes starvation wages, these once skilled workers joined immigrants from the countryside and demobilized soldiers, falling into an entirely new category, a new class, the working class. The Industrial Revolution created an entirely new group of people, those who worked in factories. As on the farm, all members of the family worked as soon as they could do so, certainly by the age of 6 years. Wages were often poor because of the huge labor market. If you didn't like them, you could be replaced. Work itself was strictly regimented. The essential quality of mass production is that work is repetitive and endless, not varied as on the farm. The emphasis was on speed, hitting quotas, producing a certain number of goods in a certain amount of time. Again, remember that on the farm, one worked mostly according to one's own pace. The hours for the typical industrial worker were 12 to 16 hours a day, winter and summer, often in total darkness, 6 days a week, 7 if behind on a quota. Again, this is in contrast to the farm, which was run according to a natural calendar, the seasons, daylight and nighttime. The conditions and atmosphere in the factory were often dark and noisy. In textile mills, the air was thick with fibers, and there was always great whirring machinery which could lop off an arm if one were not careful. Mines were full of coal dust and could collapse or flood. Elsewhere, arms manufacturers and dyers, for example, workers were exposed to dangerous chemicals, lead, and of course steam engines could always explode. And of course remember that given the laissez-faire economic policies which had made all this possible, there was no law, no government, no one to tell factory owners that this was perhaps no way to treat workers. Well, almost no one. Beginning in the early 19th century, some members of the British Parliament began to inquire into the conditions of workers in the factories. The most famous of these was undertaken by the Sadler Commission into Child Labor in 1832. Now, for the next few minutes, I'm going to quote extensively from one of these reports, if only because I think that real people are always more eloquent and more evocative of what it was like to be them than I can be as a mere historian. Now, you'll not be unfamiliar with how these inquiries work if you've ever seen congressional testimony televised. Factory owners, foremen, and child workers were called to the bar of the House and asked about conditions at the factories. But to fully appreciate what went on in the House of Commons during this testimony, you have to remember that the Ancien Regime was by no means dead. Imagine the stately walls and benches of St. Stephen's Chapel, where the House of Commons traditionally met. The questioner was probably a landowner, probably educated at an exclusive British public school like Eton or Winchester, then at Oxford or Cambridge. He was probably impeccably dressed. He probably spoke with an aristocratic accent. and he had probably never done a lick of manual labor in his entire life. The witness has no education, a thick working-class accent, which I am going to have much trouble duplicating. He probably dressed in simple workman's clothing. He had probably never before been in a place remotely like this. And so, the questioning begins. Mr. Matthew Crabtree called in and examined. Have you ever been employed in a factory? Yes. At what age did you first go to work in one? 8. That's 8 years old. How long did you continue in that occupation? 4 years. Will you state the hours of labor at the period when you first went to the factory in ordinary times? From 6 in the morning to 8 at night. 14 hours. Yes. With what intervals for refreshment and rest? An hour at noon. When trade was brisk, what were your hours? From 5 in the morning to 9 in the evening. 16 hours? Yes. This is an 8-year-old child working a 16-hour day. With what intervals at dinner? An hour. How far did you live from the mill? About 2 miles. Now note, remember, given the late British sunrise in winter, for almost 1/3 of the year, this little boy had no experience of daylight. During those long hours of labor, could you be punctual? How did you awake? I seldom did awake spontaneously. I was most generally awoke or lifted out of bed, sometimes asleep, by my parents. Were you always on time? No. What was the consequence if you had been too late? I was most commonly beaten. Severely? Very severely, I thought. In those mills, is chastisement towards the latter part of the day going on perpetually? Perpetually. So that you can hardly be in a mill without hearing constant crying? Never an hour, I believe. Do you think that if the overlooker were naturally a humane person, it would still be found necessary for him to beat the children in order to keep up their attention and vigilance at the termination of those extraordinary days of labor? Yes. However humane the slubber, the foreman, might be, as he must keep up with the machine or be found fault with, he spurs the children to keep up also by various means. By that which he commonly resorts to is to strap them when they become drowsy. At the time when you were beaten for not keeping up with your work, were you anxious to have done it if you possibly could? Yes. The dread of being beaten if we could not keep up with our work was a sufficient impulse to keep us to it if we could. When you got home at night after this labor, did you feel very much fatigued? Remember, this is a man who's never been fatigued in his life. Very much so. Had you any time to be with your parents and to receive instruction from them? No. What did you do? All that we did when we got home was to get a little bit of supper that was provided for us and to go to bed immediately. If the supper had not been ready directly, we should have gone to sleep while it was preparing. Did you not, as a child, feel it a very grievous hardship to be roused so soon in the morning? I did. And if you had been too late, were you under the apprehension of being cruelly beaten? I generally was beaten, and when I happened to be too late, and when I got up in the morning, the apprehension of that was so great that I used to run and cry all the way as I went to the mill. Elizabeth Bentley called in and examined. What time did you begin to work at the factory? When I was 6 years old. At whose factory did you work? Mr. Busk's. What kind of mill is it? Flax mill. What was your business in that mill? I was a little doffer. What were your hours of labor in that mill? From 5 in the morning till 9 at night when we were thronged, that is, busy. Now we're talking about a 6-year-old working a 16-hour day. For how long a time together have you worked that excessive length of time? For about half a year. What were your usual hours when you were not so thronged? From 6 in the morning till 7 at night. What time was allowed for your meals? 40 minutes at noon. Had you any time to get your breakfast or your drinking? No, we got it as we could. And when your work was bad and you had hardly any time to eat it at all? No, we were obliged to leave it or take it home, and when we did not take it, the overlooker took it and gave it to his pigs. Did you consider doffing a laborious employment? Yes. Explain what it is you had to do. When the frames are full, they have to stop the frames and take the flyers off and take the full bobbins off and carry them to the roller and then put empty ones on and then set the frame going again. What this means is this little kid, this little 6-year-old kid is carrying these giant bobbins such as you would see on any textile machine even today. Does that keep you constantly on your feet? Yes. There are so many frames and they run so quick. Your labor is very excessive? Yes. You have not time for anything. Suppose you flagged a little, or were too late. What would they do? Strap us. Are they in the habit of strapping those who are last in doffing? Yes. Constantly? Yes. Girls as well as boys? Yes. Have you ever been strapped? Yes. Severely? Yes. Could you eat your food well in the factory? No. Indeed, I had not much to eat, and the little I had, I could not eat it. My appetite was so poor, and being covered with dust, and it was no use to take it home. I could not eat it, and the overlooker took it and gave it to the pigs. You are speaking of the breakfast. Yes. How far had you to go for dinner? We could not go home for dinner. Where did you dine? In the mill. That is, next to the machines. So they couldn't even go home for dinner. They had to eat next to their machines. Finally, just one more. Joshua Drake, unemployed worker, called in and examined. Why do you allow your children to go to work at those places where they are ill-treated or overworked? Necessity compels a man that has children to let them work. Then you would not allow your children to go to those factories under the present system if it was not from necessity? No. Today, we often debate the relationship of government and business, and we sometimes wonder if there's too much government regulation and the necessity of labor laws. Well, this was the free market economy, complete laissez-faire economy, no restraint on how employers could treat workers. They called it the Industrial Revolution, and 6-year-old kids worked 16-hour days. Life was not much better at the end of the day. All across Europe, in Manchester, Birmingham, Lyon, Essen, and Milan, industrial towns grew too fast to plan for the arrival of hundreds of thousands of immigrants. In 1750, 1/5 of all English people lived in towns. By 1850, 3/5 did. In 1760, Manchester had just 17,000 souls. By 1830, it had 180,000, and as we've seen, by 1851, it had 303,000. Conditions there caused Frederick Ingalls to call it the shock city of the industrial age. Frederick Ingalls was the son of a factory owner in Germany who was sent out to examine his father's holdings in Manchester, and he was appalled at what he saw. And it was, of course, the thing that turned him into a lifelong communist. Tenements were hastily thrown up to house these new arrivals. The tenements were essentially row houses with tiny backyards to hang washing and to relieve oneself. There was no indoor plumbing or toilets, hence the importance of public washing and bathing facilities in Victorian towns. You know, when you go to European towns, you often see lots of fountains, and this always charms us as travelers. Well, the reason for the fountains is this was a source of water for the people who lived there. These tenement row houses would have no windows. There was nothing to see anyway. The air was thick with factory smoke and terrible smells from tanneries, dye works, animal and human excrement, assorted river smells. These slums were terribly overcrowded. Early government censuses revealed whole families, sometimes extended families, living in a single room. For example, in Paris, people were found to be living 8 and 9 to a room in the industrial sections. In St. Giles, the Irish quarter in London, 461 people were found to be living in just 12 houses. Diet was poor. Poor workers could not afford meat or fresh vegetables apart from potatoes. They subsisted on potatoes, weak stew, stimulants like tea, and depressants like alcohol. Thus, it is not surprising that these people were prone to disease. In fact, the combination of poor diet, long hours, exposure to industrial toxins and bad water supply, and overcrowding in the tenements made working-class families easy prey to typhus, cholera, diphtheria, malaria, and smallpox. These are largely, or at least until recently, have been very largely just names to us, but they were virulent and often fatal before the 20th century. Take the example of cholera. Between 1830 and 1832, 7,000 people died in London, 18,000 died in Paris, and 250,000 across Russia. A second epidemic between 1847 and 1852 cost 7,000 lives again in London, 20,000 in Paris, and 1 million people across the Russian Empire. Now, I should explain that most of the Russian deaths were not due to industrialization because Russia hadn't industrialized yet. But the Industrial Revolution was deadly enough. Circa 1840, the average death rate in Britain was 1 per 45 per year. That is, out of 45 people in the course of a year, one person would on average die. The death rate in Manchester, Engels' shock city of the industrial age, was 1 in 20. In the rural county of Rutland, life expectancy in 1840 was about 52 years if you were a professional, 38 years if you were an agricultural laborer. But if you lived in Manchester, that professional could only expect to live 38 years. And the factory worker? The average life expectancy of a factory worker in Manchester at the height of the Industrial Revolution was 17. 19th century writers were aware of what was going on. They were worried not just about the physical implications of all this, but the spiritual and moral effect on the industrial generations. Remember, these people had left their comfortable villages. They had found in the cities no welfare state, no safety net. There was no government relief, no social welfare organizations to look after these people. Charity had traditionally been entrusted to churches, but churches moved slowly and reluctantly into poor areas. In Britain, there was a government-sponsored poor law, but it was supposed to be administered at the parish level. Well, the poor law wouldn't work very well for you if there was, in fact, no parish. Remember, too, that these people were cut off from their old way of life, their extended families, their traditions, their sense of community. The new industrial economy promoted a fluid labor market in which boom and bust cycles caused people to move around the country constantly. Lots of these early industrial workers were actually Irishmen, Irish people who'd attempted to flee the famine, end up in Manchester and Birmingham, and of course are now shuttled from factory to factory, city to city, looking for work. This further broke up families. The close living conditions made privacy impossible. They promoted not only disease, but abuse, domestic violence, and sexual promiscuity. It has been estimated that 1/2 of the babies born in European cities between 1830 and 1850 were illegitimate. To cope with the daily grind, workers sought out entertainment in drinking establishments, brothels, gambling dens, and music halls. This resulted in alcoholism, venereal disease, deeper poverty, and often depression. So let's sum up. In this lecture, we have asked of the Industrial Revolution the ancient lawyer's question, cui bono? Who benefited? Now, an optimist would point to the general increase in national wealth and the British dominion of world industry, trade, and finance. It was clearly good for the country. There was a tremendous boom in productivity and new forms of transportation and communication which brought people together and extended the human horizon. Personal income in Britain rose on average by 85%, as we've seen. Certainly the rich got richer. In 1800, 1% of the population of Britain commanded 25% of the wealth of the nation. By 1850, that percentage had risen to 35%. And by the way, I looked up the current figures from the latest U.S. Census, and it turns out that in the United States today, 1% of the population now owns 37% of the wealth, though I have seen other estimates as low as 30%. The middle class also prospered, especially at the top. They moved to the country. They built fine homes. They became peers. They founded great family firms. This would in some ways be the age of the middle class. Against this, a pessimist would place the misery of the working class, the job insecurity from recurrent boom and bust cycles, the quality of life discussed above, the long hours, the dangerous working conditions, the depressing living conditions, children robbed of their childhoods, the gradual extinction of the human spirit in numbing routine, amorality, and general hopelessness. But believe it or not, there is an optimist's defense against this, which is very, very hard to refute. Let us remind ourselves that the farm had not been a worker's paradise either. Do you remember those French revolutionary peasants burning down their landlords' estates in 1789, in part because they wanted to burn the rent rolls? They wanted to make sure that nobody knew how much money and how much service they owed as a matter of law to their superiors. Do you remember that in much of Europe, serfdom continued to exist? Even if the farm had been a paradise, the agricultural revolution meant that agricultural work could no longer employ the burgeoning numbers of people that had made it possible. That is to say, as farm labor grew more efficient, fewer farm laborers were needed. I often have to explain to my students that when an industry goes more efficient, that means you don't need so many people. Those people had to go somewhere. And it might be argued that it was a very good thing that the factory system existed to absorb them. I would also remind you that the late 18th and early 19th centuries would have been hard times on people anyway. The French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars brought blockades and food shortages and trade depressions. The period saw a string of bad harvests. And don't forget the depredations of the continental system, which hurt the British economy as well as the European economy. So we can't blame everything on the factory system. Life in the city was, at the very least, exciting. There were over 800 pubs in Budapest. There were music halls. There were shops. There was a street which is itself full of stalls and peddlers and buskers, which must have been a tremendous assault on the senses. So on the one hand, you have tremendous disorientation on the part of people coming from the countryside. On the other hand, you have something which would have been far more exciting than anything they would have known at home. These various facilities provided not only excitement, but more freedom than these people had known in the country. This, I would argue, led to something positive. The rise of a true working-class culture and a sense of identity, part of what Karl Marx would later call class consciousness. The next step would be for those workers, now aware that they're a class, aware that they're a special group, to organize to fight for better pay and conditions, an option that was not open to their country cousins because they were so spread out. There was another way that the overcrowded conditions would eventually help workers. The concentration of workers in the cities meant that they and their plight could no longer be ignored, could not be ignored, if only because they threatened to overwhelm all the progress that European civilization had made up to this point. Let me give you one example, a piece of writing written by James Phillips Kay, a Manchester physician, who wrote in 1832 of the streets of Manchester, "The state of the streets powerfully affects the health of their inhabitants. Want of cleanliness, of forethought and economy are found an almost invariable alliance with dissipation, reckless habits, and disease. The population gradually becomes physically less efficient as the producers of wealth. Were such manners to prevail, the horrors of pauperism would accumulate. A debilitated race would be rapidly multiplied. Morality would afford no check to the increase of population. Crime and disease would be its only obstacles. A dense mass, impotent alike of great moral or physical efforts, would accumulate. They would drag on an unhappy existence, vibrating between the pangs of hunger and the delirium of dissipation, alternately exhausted by severe and oppressive toil or enervated by supine sloth." In other words, what this author does is he takes the physical conditions we've described and he extrapolates from them to the moral situation of these people and indeed the decline of the British people overall. Long before they organized themselves, the plight of the working class began to be noticed and debated by intellectuals and politicians. In a way, the Industrial Revolution made more urgent the questions raised by the French Revolution by making it impossible to ignore the man in the equation rights of man. The whole Enlightenment project seemed to be at stake. In the next lecture, the intellectual and political response to the Industrial Revolution.